Hello and good morning. Most of you know who I am. If you don't, that's all right. Key point for this presentation is I am the technical lead for structured data capture, which is going to be exercising a whole bunch of the conformance stuff that I'm talking about. So I will sometimes color things a little bit with how I'm planning to use it and why. Other than that, you can Google me or find me on chat.fhir.org. My objective for this morning is to help people understand the existing conformance capabilities that we have around mustSupport. We'll talk about some of the places where that's causing us problems and what we're going to do to replace it. And then we'll look at a bunch of other resources that are introduced as part of R5, but that we plan to make available for use in implementation guides for earlier releases as well, and how all those things sort of interplay with each other and let you do cool new things as you describe what you want systems to do or what your system actually does. So in terms of something that a lot of people coming into FHIR have a problem sort of wrapping their head around is, how is mustSupport different from cardinality? Cardinality is exactly what it says. It's what is the minimum number of repetitions that can appear in the instance, what's the maximum number of repetitions that can appear in the instance. It's all about validation, and it's evaluated in the context of just, does this instance say or contain the data that I expect it to contain? We have so that's just a simple, what's the lower bound number, what's the upper bound number. We have another capability in profiles and data types, et cetera, which is constraints, which allows us to talk about cardinality in a conditional sense. So this element needs to be present in certain circumstances, or is only allowed to be present in certain circumstances. And it is also used from an instance validation perspective. mustSupport is not used when you're validating your instance. In fact, you can't evaluate whether somebody complies with mustSupport looking at an instance. The only way that you can tell whether somebody is meeting a mustSupport requirement is looking at the behavior of their system, either before they produce the instance or after they're consuming the instance. It is focused on things like, are you storing it? Are you displaying it in your user interface? Are you allowing a user to capture new values for it? Are you considering it as part of your decision support logic? And people say, well, why do you care about that? And the example I typically give is deceased state. We do not want to make deceased state mandatory. That would be a bad thing in healthcare. But by the same token, we don't want to have a system that says, well, deceased state is optional, so I'll just ignore it. I'll throw it away. I won't store it. I won't display it. I won't let people capture it in the user interface. Because if you are a registry system or you are managing vital statistics, you kind of need to be capable of dealing with it. So mustSupport is the mechanism that we have to talk about what do we expect your system to do, irrespective of whether the data always has to be in the instance. And so we knew that we wanted to have something like that from the very early days of FHIR, and mustSupport was our solution to that problem. However, mustSupport has a bunch of problems with it. One of the problems is, what does it mean? Well, it might mean that you have to store it. It might mean you have to display it. It might mean you have to allow a user to enter it. But exactly what it means varies from implementation guide to implementation guide, because there are systems that don't store anything and aren't supposed to. You send something to a real-time decision support engine, it doesn't want to hold on to your data. It's going to look at your data, it's going to give an answer, it's going to spit it back. It's also not going to display the data because it's a server system. There's nobody to look at it. It's processing data real time. And so you have to read the text of the implementation guide or the text of the profile or the comments on a specific data element to figure out what does mustSupport mean. And it might change. So you might have a general mustSupport set of rules on the implementation guide, or that you inherit from a parent implementation guide, and then you refine them in text somewhere else, and you refine them in the profile somewhere else, and you refine them in the comment somewhere else. And so from a computable perspective, if I want to test stuff, I have no way of knowing what the expectations are for the system around this particular data element. So I'm talking testing here, not validation. But it's nice to be able to test systems. I sent data, data came back, did it change? Well, yes, it changed. Is that okay? I don't know. I have to go read the text to find out. Another challenge with mustSupport is we have mustSupport. We don't have a notion of should support or may support. And often in IGs, you want to say things like that. It's not, you must store this, because I can't be that strong, but I'd really, really, really like you to store it, and I'd like you to call your attention to this data element. And so we do funky things in our implementation guides to make data elements show up in the differential, not because we've really changed anything, but because otherwise they just hide amongst this massive stuff that we don't care about. And so we just make a tiny change so that it shows up in the differential so that people notice that, hey, this element exists. And it would actually be nice to be able to say, this is a should, this is a may, as opposed to something being a shall. But the biggest problem that we have with mustSupport is people embed mustSupports in their profiles, and then somebody else comes along and says, you know, that profile, that's perfect, it's got the extensions I want, I can live with all the mandatories, but I have to create my own because you've said certain things are mustSupport, or you've described mustSupport in a particular way that doesn't work for me. So US Core puts mustSupport on certain things, and then I come along and say, but I'm not an EHR, and I'm not going to behave in the same way as an EHR does, and so I can't build on top of US Core, and so they go create their own. Or alternatively, US Core keeps getting told, you know what, we can't use your stuff because it's mustSupport, and so they remove mustSupport from their stuff to encourage reuse, and then they don't get the tight conformance in one of their primary use cases. So we got that challenge with the ability to reuse, and Graham was talking at the beginning of today about the challenges that people are seeing with an explosion of profiles, and mustSupport is definitely a cause of that. So we went back to the drawing board and tried to figure out what we could do better. And in the lead up to R5, we actually introduced obligation into ElementDefinition, so it would actually show up in profiles as a core element. But we pulled it out of that, moved it into an extension right before we published, because we said, you know what, we probably are going to want to make some changes to this because it's really important and we haven't actually had a chance to use it yet. And having gone through this back trying to use it, I'm glad we did that because there's a bunch of things I want to change. But the notion with obligation is, rather than having this Boolean flag of you must support this or not, we can actually now talk in more detail about what expectations are. So there's a whole bunch of stuff here. The first thing is a code, and it's a repeating code, and the code talks about what is it that your actual expectation is. I want you to store, I want you to display, I want you to allow data entry, I want you to hold on to this unchanged, and you can list the specific behaviors that you want to have for this particular element. The second piece is that you can differentiate who has those expectations. So rather than every single person who claims to adhere to this profile having to follow the same set of rules, you can have different set of rules with the same profile. So I can say, this system is a client system, and so it needs to display information, it needs to allow data entry of information, but it doesn't have to store diddly squat. It can be a browsing tool or a smart app that has no persistence whatsoever. And I can use that same profile with a different obligation on the same element and say, well, this is for the server, and they don't have to display anything, and they don't have to allow data entry of anything, but they absolutely have to store data, and furthermore, I expect them to store the data and not make changes to the data between what I give them and what comes back. And so we can list multiple actors. Diego, so we need a mic first.
One stupid question, maybe you said, and I didn't pay attention. Extension is an extension where?
So this extension is currently defined in the tooling IG.
But in which resource?
The extension appears on ElementDefinition. So it will manifest in profiles. We won't ever use this in a resource or data type because those are independent. They have no obligations. But when you're creating profiles, that's where it'll come into play. Good question. So we have what are our expectations, and we have who are the expectations for. Actor is optional, so if you don't specify any actors, then the implication is that it applies to everybody, but you have the ability to be more fine-grained in terms of who the obligations apply to. Then we've got documentation, which is self-explanatory, and then we've got these other four things that allow you to make the obligations conditional. So usage context is a complex data structure that we throw in on all of our conformance resources, and now we embed it here, and we've also got it in our additional bindings. And it lets you say, this context or this obligation applies, but it only applies if you're dealing with humans, or if you're dealing with cows, or you're dealing with pediatrics, or you're in Canada, or you're dealing with admissions. So you have the ability to partition where or the context that this requirement applies to. Filter and filter documentation allow you to basically create a FHIR path that says this obligation only applies, for example, to if the observation code is in this value set. So you have to have a value and you have to store the value, but you only have to store it in these certain circumstances. Process is if you are adhering to such and such a business process, so pointing to some sort of external definition. All of this is complicated. You don't necessarily have to use this. I'm not sure how often this bottom stuff is going to actually get used. And when we move obligation back into ElementDefinition as a core element, we might say, you know what, these things stay as extensions because they're a little bit more esoteric. But for now, we've sort of got them all in there as these are things that we know we have use cases at least sometimes for doing, and we built that into the structure. So let's go take a look at the codes. Key thing with the codes is that they have built into them post-coordination. We got another question. So we have the ability for all of them to say this is a shall, or this is a should, or this is a may.
Sorry, two questions, if I may, before going to the content. The filter, not a change request, but just a question for understanding the scope. Would it make sense to have expression there to say use it if this is that validates?
It is an expression. The filter is an expression, so I'm not quite.
It was string there, so.
It is, but it's string because we limit it specifically to FHIR path. So you can't throw in CQL. You can't throw in any language of choice. It's a specific FHIR path.
And then the other question is, we have requirements as a resource. We have requirements as an element in ElementDefinition, and now we have the documentation as a markdown there. Should those be somewhat not put together, but referenced from each other? For example, the markdown there, could it also link to a requirements document or somewhere?
I mean, we could have an extension that points to requirements all over the place. I mean, to me, the documentation here is more about the why. So I'm saying that you have to do these things for this particular element, for this particular actor. The documentation, I can sort of expand on what is the purpose of this? Why am I saying that this is true? That's what I would probably put there. We're going to talk about linkages to requirements in a little bit. You're going to hit your limit, Jose.
Just to follow up. I have to work on these things then. So the requirements element in the document, in the element definition would be for requirements that apply whatever are the conditions of the element.
Why is this why is this element necessary and why is it constrained the way that it is?
Right, because then I think this guidance should go out, like if you have any constraints there or any context-specific constraints, you might think of putting them into the obligations where they might belong if you have obligations, right?
Yeah, obligations allow you to define computably what the expectation is for behavior of certain systems around this particular data element. All right. So in terms of types of codes that we can have, it's things like I am able to send. So I have demonstrated in conformance testing or something that I'm able to send this element. Doesn't necessarily mean I always will. It's kind of up to me whether I feel like it or not. Must send, on the other hand, says that I'm obligated to transmit this data unless there is something that prohibits me. So if there's regulation or consent that says I'm not allowed to give it to you, then obviously I'm not going to give it to you, but there's an expectation that if the data exists, I have to transmit it. In narrative, expectation that the data that I have is actually going to be surfaced in the narrative for the resource. In UI, which is a code that I want to rename, says that I'm allowed to edit this element. You can put things up into a UI that you don't necessarily have to edit. In store is about I'm going to persist this unaltered, I'm going to store this, and I'm not going to make changes to it, or maybe not even store it, just as I go from receive it from A and transmit it to C, that I'm not going to mess around with it. Process is an interesting one. It says that I'm going to take this into account as part of my processing. The processing of a given system is obviously going to be very different. I can have process on a decision support system. It's going to mean one thing. I'm using this in SDC for form fillers, receiving questionnaires, and there it's I'm going to enforce these rules on the answers. So I'm going to enforce this regular expression, or I'm going to enforce this cardinality limit, or whatever. So those are the kinds of things that you can do, but this is an extensible value set. So if there are other specialized things that you want to be able to say about what systems have to do, you can create your own codes and use those as well. How are we going to use this in structured data capture? In structured data capture, we have a grab bag of requirements. All of the cool and fancy things that you might want to do with a questionnaire that didn't fit within the 80% rule, where we can't say that most systems in the world support this, we threw all of them into structured data capture. So we have abilities to populate forms, extract data from forms, have support for tables and sliders, and be able to hide questions and do all sorts of weird, wild, and crazy things. And the challenge that we have is that we've got a bunch of different profiles that we've created, all on questionnaire. So we've got a profile for populating questionnaires from observation data and populating questionnaires from expressions, and people use that either with CQL or with FHIR. And we have other profiles for extracting and other profiles that talk about fancy display, and there's probably 30, 40 different capabilities that you can do within that fancy display profile. And what we're finding is that implementers come and look at our spec and say, that's cool. I want this part, and I want a little bit of this, and I want some of that, and I want this part. But there's no mechanism when you are creating a derived profile to derive a profile from 5 different things. And so they end up creating their own profile. And they leverage our stuff, and they claim alignment, but it's hard to computably test that they are aligned, and doesn't work very well. So with this new obligation mechanism, we're going to have a single questionnaire profile, which will introduce a whole whack of extensions that can be used for a wide variety of purposes, but we're going to create a whole bunch of actors. And so we will have an actor that says, I am a form designer. So we have application roles to talk about people who create forms, people or systems that fill out forms, systems that allow forms to be stored on them and search for them. And then we can go through and say, these are the types of behaviors that we expect to see. So form designer, You have to be able to send the stuff that you've created. You have to be able to display stuff. You have to let people edit it. You have to share the data that you've got. Form filler, all they have to do is be able to process. They don't have to be able to do other kinds of things. Form managers, they have to be able to send, have to be able to share, and they have to not mess around with what they've got. So that's the base set of actors. And then we want to create sub-actors to say, I support tables. So this is the set of extensions and perhaps some of the terminology codes that I have to handle in order to do tables. And another actor that says I do sliders. And another actor that says I do XHTML rendering, so I can include bold and italics and make something purple or whatever in the text of my question. And we can list all of those capabilities, and then a downstream system, DaVinci, Gravity, whoever wants to leverage SDC can just say, yeah, this list of 10 actors, that's what I do or that's what I require. So a much simpler mechanism. And some of these requirements, for example, with sliders, you want to specify what is your lower bound, what is your upper bound, what is your step size. We might say that support for step size is a should rather than a shall. Because if you don't specify that in your questionnaire design, if you don't support that, then you'll just arbitrarily choose a step size, and that's probably all right. But knowing where you're allowed to start, where you're allowed to stop, that's a shall, because otherwise you're going to end up with non-conformant data. So we can do things like that. And that, we think, is going to allow our people to define what they want to do without going off and sort of creating their own thing. And second, we'll be able to be much more precise about what we really want each of those systems to do. Tied into obligations is another capability. This one is in core for introducing additional bindings. We've long had several extensions that allowed us to introduce bindings, but that was a little bit complicated for folks. It's similar to what we can do with obligations in that we have the ability to have additional bindings that are also context specific. But there's a few bindings that are particularly useful for us in the area of conformance. So minimum binding is saying this is the set of codes that you have to support. And we're going to use this, for example, when I say I support sliders, I will include a minimum binding that says, you know, that control type code that says this needs to be a slider, I have to support that in order to be a slider-enabled system. We also have a notion of current. It's a strange name, but essentially it says that if you're dealing with net new data and data that is originating in your system, then this set of binding rules applies. We have a problem in a number of the national IGs where they really want to say you have to use this terminology. You have to use SNOMED. You have to use ICD-10. You have to use whatever your country's language or not language codes, your country's drug codes happen to be. The problem is you've got all of this existing data that doesn't necessarily comply with those rules, or sometimes you're receiving data from external systems that doesn't comply with those rules. And realistically, you're not going to have somebody sitting there and translating the data that's coming in or go through all of your legacy data and update it to be SNOMED or ICD-10 or whatever. And so current allows you to say anything that is net new, you have to be using this terminology. Anything that is legacy, anything that's coming from external, this set of rules doesn't apply. You can't validate that in the instance because you have no idea where the data came from, but you can absolutely do that in testing in terms of try entering in data and see whether it gets coded according to this current system or not, and if it doesn't, then it's non-conformant. UI is about identifying what are the codes that are appropriate for displaying in the user interface. We have value sets that are enormous. Things like UCOM, which is essentially an infinite code system, having a set of codes that are useful for the user interface, again, is something that we can do there. Another new requirement or another new resource that we're making available in R5, but are backporting to make available in previous releases as well, is the requirements resource. We introduced this in part because Jose kept whining about it, but also it's useful in IHE processes and several others. We also are planning to use it in HL7 for EHR functional models. And it allows us to capture where did the requirements come from to provide traceability. And so we can link our profiles, we can link our conformance statements, we can link even down to individual data elements to particular requirement statements and have traceability of why is this the way that it is. And we can also see how do these requirements manifest in a given design. The actor concept that we leverage in obligation, that we also leverage in requirements, because requirements apply to specific actors, is its own resource. We have an ActorDefinition resource that we introduce in R5, and it can talk about people, it can also talk about systems. So you can actually explore what are we expecting people to do within systems as well. Actors can exist in a hierarchy, and unlike profiles, they can exist in a polyhierarchy. So I can have multiple parent actors for my actor. So when I am defining myself and saying that I am a Da Vinci form filler, I can then say that means that I am an SDC generic form filler, and I am an SDC table form filler, and I am an SDC observation pre-population system, and point to all of the different actors that define stuff that I care about. And that means that all of the obligations that were defined for those other actors now also apply to me. Another place that we are going to be introducing new stuff, this is not yet available. We've defined how we want it to work, but we haven't published it anywhere yet, is a revision around capability statement. We had hoped and intended for this to be part of R5, but we had problems getting the community to the point where they had tested enough or tested it at all beyond Graham, and Graham testing with himself only gets us so far, for us to be confident in publishing it. We have a problem with the existing capability statement resource in that people keep wanting it to be able to say more and more and more stuff, because you want to be able to talk about what a terminology servers want to be able to express in terms of what they can do, what do smart systems want to be able to express in terms of what they can do, what do conformance servers want to express in terms of what they can do, and everybody has these extra things that they want to talk about and say, please declare if you do X. And so they keep asking us, well, we add the ability to specify what combinations of search parameters are allowed, or requirements in terms of what modifiers are permitted.
Capability statement. This is Mario. More than 75% of all capability statements that we introspect that are part of what we see testing are incorrect, are errors. They don't even pass validation. 75%.
Yep.
Based on empirical evidence, based on connectathons, based on more than 60,000 test executions per day, the client implementations, whether it's a server representing a client or a client interacting with a server, the number is so close to zero, it is almost zero, where the client actually asks for the capability statement and evaluates the result. Any idea how we can fix that?
So There's a couple of challenges with clients interacting with capability statements. One is what the capability statement says right now is often not enough for them to understand whether it does what they want to make that interaction useful. The second is that capability statements are getting ginormous. A capability statement for a regular electronic health record means you're listing every single resource that you support, every single operation that you support on those resources, every single search parameter that you support on those resources, all the custom operations that you support, and all of the other extensional stuff that you want to say about them. And so you're bringing down a 2 megabyte or a 4 megabyte capability statement, and all the application is trying to figure out is, can I write this resource to your system? It's overkill. And so one of the things that we're doing with, so capability statement says having all of your stuff defined as explicit elements in capability statement does not scale. And we've learned that when you have a huge and ever increasing data model, that it's probably time to move the complexity into terminology. And that's what capability statement does, is it allows us to define a terminology that talks about what is it that this system does. And so that also means that rather than us in FHIR Core defining the complete set of everything that you could possibly say about a system, implementation guides can now introduce concepts to say, here's a thing that you can do, and here's how you define it, and you can now make that assertion in your capability statement. Once we've done that, we then have the ability to define an operation that says, these are the capabilities I actually care about. Can you do these things? And get back an operation response that says, yes, I do all those things, or I do all those things except for these two. And that's a much more useful way for client applications to engage. So they don't have to see everything that you can do. They just ask, can you do these bits, which are the parts that I care about? And hopefully, so that will be less about, is your entire capability statement conformant, but rather, can you answer the question of, can you do what it is that I need to be able to do? And so we're hoping that as that ability to ask the useful question comes into play, that people will start asking the question more. Whether they will or not, we will find out. One of the questions that we have for the community is this useful enough that you will engage in the project and participate in Connectathon and see this actually get into an implementation guide and used? Because if you don't, then that says to us that nobody cares about capability statement and we will quit trying. Next part is in the testing space. We have a new test resource called Test Plan that allows us to talk at a higher level what are our intentions around testing. It allows us to point to test scripts as a mechanism for testing, but allows us to point to other things as well. Test script has been around for a while, but we know that we need to do more around that resource in terms of implementation guide and publishing. The FHIR HL7 IG publisher now has the ability to include a tab in your implementation guides that talks about what are the testing capabilities that you've got, test plans and or test scripts. And so you've got cross-references between your profiles and other resources and the things that test them. And now with obligations, we ought to be able to start auto-generating at least some basic test scripts in that we know what the expected behaviors are around certain elements. With a capability statement, we then know what are the operations that you support, and we can start to just produce automatically some basic test scripts for an implementation guide. And once that's in play and you're starting to see, well, I've got some test scripts for free, because they're hard to write. It's a fair bit of work to create a good test script and create all of the data that goes with it. But if we can start to generate some, then that will hopefully create the demand for more. Because a really good way to document how your implementation guide is supposed to behave is to actually include the test expectations as part of that. Not all of this stuff is figured out. There are some things that I would like to see changed, and there will be ongoing discussion around obligations and some of these other things around how we can make it better. So for example, I talked about how form filler, there's a certain set of behaviors that I want, as opposed to a form manager, there's a different set of behaviors that I want. I'd like to define that set of behaviors as a collection and then talk about should versus shall of the collection. Can't do that right now. Contexts, if I want to talk about human medicine and I want to talk about Canadian and I want to talk about oncology, it'd be nice to be able to reuse that as a concept. We can't do that right now. We have this ability to define all of these different behavioral codes, but they're kind of longish, and rendering them in implementation guides takes up a fair bit of real estate. It'd be nice to have a little icon that I can include for each type of behavior. So maybe we'll have a standard extension that lets us do that and define standard icons for those codes and icons that help us figure out, is this a should or a shall or a may? So I can just visually look and say, okay, I understand what's going on. Quite often I'm going to have a standard set of behavior. So if I flag something at all, it's probably this. And so having a way of defining what that typical expectation of must store, must display, whatever that is, and then highlight the differences, I think will also be helpful for people looking and trying to understand what's going on. We have requirements right now scattered throughout our implementation guides in terms of what should a system do, what shall a system do. It'd be nice to be able to somehow consolidate that information into a table so we can quickly see what are the formal rules that have to be adhered to and be able to link those into test cases. We don't have that yet. Right now, Actor points to capability statements, and I think that that's backwards. I think that capability statements probably needs to point to Actor, so we'll be exploring that. So a bunch of things, and I'm sure I haven't got a complete list, so I would encourage people to engage and start playing around with these new capabilities, but don't necessarily say, yes, this is how it's going to be, and I will create my entire infrastructure around this, and then get really annoyed if we tweak things in 3 months, because we're probably going to tweak things in 3 months and probably tweak them some more in 6 months. So it's an evolving space. So hopefully, when you walk out of this, you'll have a sense of what these different conformance resources are for. Actors lets you define the people and participants involved in the exchange. Requirements allows you to document your business and your technical and your other requirements and give you traceability on those. Obligations is going to supersede MustSupport and gives us a much more robust mechanism of documenting what do we expect systems to do. Capability statement gives us more robustness as well, but this is more about the interface behaviors. And then test plan and test script allow us to share test scripts between test artifacts between systems to verify that our systems are actually doing everything that we've defined. So we have a little bit more time for questions. Somebody who hasn't asked a question yet.
Thank you for this excellent presentation. You mentioned the issues we have with MustSupport. Why are they always inherited? I mean, it would solve a lot of problems if I could drop a MustSupport in a dropped resource, in a derived resource.
So when we move to obligations, the obligations will not drop. They will still be there. But because they are actor specific, if you are interested in a different set of functionality, all you have to do is define a distinct actor, and suddenly all of the obligations that were previously there no longer apply because they apply to other actors, they don't apply to you. So it's not quite the same as dropping things, but because they're still there, but you have more capability around does it apply to you or not.
But it would be helpful to make things clearer that the sign for MustSupport could be eliminated.
Yeah, we're not going to worry about MustSupport anymore. We're basically moving to a place where MustSupport isn't going to be relevant because we're going to use obligations instead. We talked about that, but there were a bunch of other issues with just saying, well, MustSupport doesn't inherit because there are lots of circumstances where you want it to. I think Isaac was actually next, but.
Thank you. Okay. Thanks, Lloyd. Great talk. Really appreciate the topic. This is important. Man, I super worry about all this UI stuff. It's like in most, I can totally understand, like there's really specific use cases, and like the form filler, you know, the form designer type use case was a really good use case for like places where you want to like place conformance requirements about whether or not an interoperated data element can be edited, whether or not it's mandated to be displayed. But like just defining a standard language for how an interoperability spec dictates like a clinician user interface seems like just a recipe for like disaster for me. I don't know, am I overreacting? Or, you know, can you talk about that? Like, what could those be extensions, stuff like that?
Well, I mean, the mechanism is there. In the whole conformance space, people who design specs imagine that they have the ability to influence the world in ways that they often don't. So it's not like, I'll put it in the spec and that will make it happen. That's not the reality. So there are circumstances where you absolutely do want and need to say, this must be stored, this must be displayed, this must be editable. It's really up to the specification development is a consensus process. So if you have the people who are going to be impacted by the specification involved in the decision and saying, yes, we agree, this is a reasonable expectation to have, and this is something that should be explicit so that everybody's playing by the same rules and we are all displaying this, or we're all agreeing that this is a should display, it's not a shall display, then that makes sense. But it's not something to do in isolation. And Graham has thoughts on it as well. So he's responding to the question, I think.
I mean, it's in the list because there are implementation guides already doing this. And I mean, I agreed with everything that Lloyd said and everything that you said. And I expect this to be a fertile area of disagreement. But in the end, really it depends what kind of spec you're writing. And when you are writing a specification that's very precisely defining a workflow and the obligations and the things that make the workflow happen, maybe it's getting appropriate to make those kind of rules. But in other, totally inappropriate, and you should ignore them, yes.
So I think about this problem that you mentioned around MustSupports being directly inherited into derived profiles quite a bit.
Yep.
We experience it quite a bit, and it's one of the main drivers of our variances. And so when we're thinking about obligations and the tooling that goes around that, and how, as iGuide authors, we can design our profiles in such a way that will make them more likely to be reprofiled. Mm-hmm. I'm curious if there are ways of using sets of obligations so that derivative profiles, because you mentioned actors as like being the main mechanism in which someone kind of opts out of something that isn't appropriate for them.
Or more specifically, opts into the things that are appropriate to them.
How granular are we expecting that opt-in? Because I think what we're going to uncover when we're working with this mechanism is rapid feedback on items that may not work in some countries. And we want to make sure we're not throwing out the baby with the bathwater when we're trying to get them to derive from guides. So I'm curious how much granularity will be considered in the design decisions for this.
I mean, the tool, the notion of ActorDefinition has no intrinsic level of granularity to it. So if I wanted to say hospital pharmacy systems in Edmonton, Alberta, and define an actor for that set of behaviors, I could do that. Whether it's worth the amount of effort for the benefit that I get out of it, I don't know. But the way I look at it is something like US core. I mean, I know this is Europe and nobody cares, but actually everybody cares because it impacts all sorts of things. You could have US core profiles that talk about what are the data element expectations in terms of extensions or mandatories, and has an actor that is US CDI server. and have really explicit must supports for that. And so if you are an EHR that is obligated to that set of regulation, you kind of have to point to that actor and comply with it. But if you are a decision support system, you can totally ignore that actor, and your must supports are completely different, and you can still derive from that same profile. That to me is the power of the obligation piece, is that you decide, am I one of these actors? So in the SDC space, am I a form filler? Then I darn well better be pointing to the base form filler actor. I can still choose whether I'm going to be a form filler that does tables or a form filler that does population, and which of the population approaches I support, if any. And you choose those actors. I mean, it could be that a regulation will say, you shall be such and such an actor, in which case, that's what you have to do.
All right. We are at time. So if there are any more questions, ask them personally to Lloyd, or better yet, as Lloyd says, ask them on chat.fhir.org. Thank you, everyone.